Just down the street, inside another unique Washington, D.C. museum, are the belongings of an equally famous criminal. Unlike the Unabomber, this outlaw is seen as a dashing hero. But is there any truth to the legend of Jesse James? More to come on Mysteries at the Museum. Washington, D.C. Among the monuments that celebrate our nation's history is an institution dedicated to a sensational aspect of America's past. It is the Museum of Crime and Punishment. Here, the country's most famous fugitives and their crimes are immortalized. And one artifact belongs in a category all its own. It's made of hand-stitched leather and harkens back to a time when gunslingers and desperados ruled the Wild West. It's a holster that once belonged to America's best-known outlaw, Jesse James.
The legends say that he was a Robin Hood, this mythical outlaw hero who robbed from the rich to give to the poor.
But is the legend true? Or did this holster really belong to a cold-blooded criminal hell-bent on revenge? May 25th, 1863. 16-year-old Jesse Woodson James is working in the quiet fields of his family farm in Kearney, Missouri. But behind this scene of rural tranquility lurks the specter of slavery and civil war. As slave-owning farmers, Jesse James' family strongly support the Confederate cause. In fact, Jesse's older brother Frank has enlisted with a gang of guerrilla fighters who are hiding out in the woods near the family farm.
Union soldiers always came to the James farm looking for Frank. And on this day, they came to the farm. Jesse was in the field.
Before Jesse can run away, the soldiers grab both him and his stepfather, Reuben Samuels, who they go on to brutally interrogate.
They took him and hanged him on this tree about 3 or 4 times. Every time he would look like he was passing out, they let him down.
As soon as Samuels catches his breath, the soldiers demand to know where Frank James and the guerrillas are hiding.
And he wouldn't tell them where Frank was, so they would hang him again.
Though his stepfather survives the incident, the image of Samuels being brutally tortured by Union soldiers is indelibly stamped on the young Jesse's mind. When he is old enough, Jesse also leaves home to join up with Frank and the guerrilla soldiers in the forest. There he begins an apprenticeship with one of the most feared killers of the Civil War, Bloody Bill Anderson.
With a name like Bloody Bill, you can almost see what he is known for. His real name is William Anderson. He was more an outlaw than he was a soldier.
Bloody Bill schools the young Jesse James in the tactics of guerrilla warfare.
They attacked in the most brutal way that they could. They would enter a town yelling the rebel yell. People would become paralyzed with fear. They would take whatever valuable possessions they had. They would kill them, and they would look them in the eye while they did it.
But the violent excesses of the Missouri guerrillas do nothing to prevent the inevitable Confederate defeat. In 1865, the South surrenders, and thousands of embittered Confederate soldiers return home. But not Jesse James. The battle-hardened rebel recast himself as a robber of banks and trains.
After the war, Jesse did not give up his hatred for the Union government. Instead, he was even more resolved that what he was doing was right. Whenever he robbed a bank or robbed a train, he made it known that these were things that the Yankees owned.
When newspapers sympathetic to the Confederate cause report on the robberies, they portray James's exploits in a positive light.
The legend says he would not rob any Confederate people, and nor would he rob any women. That he was robbing the rich, the people who were oppressing them, to give back to the poor.
Newspapers across the country pick up the stories, and soon Jesse James becomes known to the nation not as a murderous criminal, but rather as a brave defender of Southern rights.
Jesse loved his fame, and he loved reading about himself in the newspapers.
Then, in 1882, James is shot in the back by a member of his own gang, Robert Ford. It seems a fitting end to a life marked by violence. But far from putting the legend to rest, Jesse's murder has the opposite effect.
When Jesse died, the newspapers covered him for almost a month. They told the story of his life, how he was this native son, beloved by all of the people.
The murder of Jesse James turns him into a martyr, cementing his position as an American icon. But the legend does not match the man.
He didn't care who he was robbing. He didn't care whose gold he was taking.
And there is little evidence to support the claim that Jesse James ever stole from the rich to give to the poor.
They would rather think that he was stealing the money of the Yankees, but that is not held up against historical records.
In the end, the violence James witnessed as a young boy and the barbarous apprenticeship he served under Bloody Bill transformed him into a vengeful and violent criminal. He lived by the gun and died by the gun. So it is fitting that his life should be summed up by this brittle leather holster, which remains on display at the Museum of Crime and Punishment in Washington, D.C. Next, on Mysteries at the Museum.
And a knife wielded by an infamous serial killer.
It's linked to a series of crimes that remain unsolved even to this day.
Within the walls of great institutions lie secrets waiting to be revealed. These are the Mysteries at the Museum. From bank robber John Dillinger's death mask to serial killer Ted Bundy's car and John Wayne Gacy's infamous clown outfit, the museum sheds a uniquely personal light on the nation's criminal justice system. But tucked away from these high-profile artifacts sits a generic object whose everyday use belies the notoriety of its infamous owner.
The object is made of green plastic, blade metal. It's 4 inches long. It weighs less than a pound.
But as author Wendell Watkins can attest, the identity of its owner casts a haunting shadow on this commonplace object.
That particular individual is linked to crimes that remain unsolved even to this day.
Who owned this knife? And how was he connected to one of the most notorious murder cases of the 20th century? Massachusetts, June 14th, 1962. Police find the lifeless body of 55-year-old Anna Schlechers in her Boston apartment, a bathrobe cord pulled tightly around her neck.
6 days after that, another woman was found strangled in her apartment. And 6 days after that, yet another woman was found strangled in her apartment. That started the police to think they may have a serial killer on their hands.
As the list of murder victims grows, the killer comes to be known as the Boston Strangler. Over the next 18 months, the killings continue unabated and unsolved. Then, after the 11th strangling, the murders suddenly stop.
It's like the strangler disappeared.
For the next year, the police continue to hunt for a suspect, to no avail. Then, in March of 1965, the case is blown wide open. A mentally unstable man incarcerated since the previous November at a state psychiatric hospital confesses to being the infamous Boston Strangler. His name is Albert DeSalvo.
Albert DeSalvo is 33 years old, and he's listed as his occupation as a handyman, but he already has an extensive rap sheet for assault.
DeSalvo also has a history of breaking and entering, but he claims that's not how he gained access to the victims' apartments.
His modus operandi was that he used this maintenance uniform where he would ring the doorbells and knock on the doors and offer to fix things.
Because the crime scenes showed no sign of forced entry, investigators had been convinced that the Strangler somehow managed to gain the trust of his victims. DeSalvo's confession seems to confirm this suspicion. And as DeSalvo describes the crimes in near photographic detail, authorities become more and more convinced that they have their man.
Police said he started presenting information that they hadn't revealed to the public. He was able to describe what the victims were wearing, and he was also able to tell them how they were killed.
But the police have a problem.
As detailed as the confessions were, there was never any physical evidence that tied Albert DeSalvo to any of the cases.
But authorities catch a break. DeSalvo is soon convicted of unrelated sexual assault charges, and in 1967, he's sentenced to life in prison.
This whole process served a purpose to bring closure to the Boston Strangler event. Even though technically the crimes remained unsolved, the stranglings had stopped, and the alleged perpetrator was off the streets.
Authorities believe they can finally close the case of the notorious Boston Strangler. Then, 6 years later, DeSalvo makes a frantic call to a former prison psychiatrist, Dr. Ames Roby.
He tells him he needs to talk to him right away, that he wants to tell him the real story as to what happened with the Boston Strangler.
DeSalvo seems highly agitated, so much so that the psychiatrist promises to visit the confessed killer the very next day.
What the public knows about the Boston Strangler appears to be in jeopardy.
Could Albert DeSalvo be innocent of the murders to which he confessed? It's 1973, and the confessed Boston Strangler, Albert DeSalvo, is serving a life sentence in a Massachusetts prison. But when he urgently requests a meeting with his former prison psychiatrist, promising to share the real story of the killings, people start to wonder if DeSalvo is actually the man responsible for these heinous crimes. Psychiatrist Ames Roby is eager to hear what his former patient has to say. But the morning of the scheduled visit, prison staff opened DeSalvo's cell to find a shocking sight. The confessed murderer has been brutally stabbed to death. This switchblade, now at the Museum of Crime and Punishment in Washington, D.C., lies unused at his side.
Apparently, he was trying to defend himself and never had a chance to.
Prison officials soon determined that DeSalvo was likely targeted due to his involvement in a prison drug ring, but no one is ever convicted of the murder. For many, the demise of the Boston Strangler is welcome news, but others are left to wonder what critical information Albert DeSalvo was so eager to reveal. Dr. Roby believes that DeSalvo was going to admit that his 1965 confession was a lie and that he was not the notorious serial killer. But why would he admit guilt if he wasn't responsible?
Dr. Roby characterized Albert DeSalvo as a person who craved attention, and that's part of the reason why he would seek to take credit for what the Boston Strangler had done.
Dr. Roby's skepticism is shared by others.
There were several investigators who didn't believe that the Boston Strangler was just one person. They thought that it was at least two people working separately.
But if DeSalvo didn't commit the crimes, how did he know enough about them to give such a detailed confession?
Even though Albert DeSalvo knew a lot about the details of the crimes, a lot of that was published in the newspapers.
Furthermore, some have suggested that the police peppered him with leading questions during the original interrogation. But the answer may also lie with the time DeSalvo spent at the Psychiatric Institute under Dr. Roby's care.
One of the things that Dr. Roby noticed was that Albert DeSalvo was spending a lot of time with another inmate, George Nassar, a two-time convicted murderer who was also on parole during the time of the stranglings.
Some believe that Nassar committed at least some of the murders and fed the details to the fame-hungry DeSalvo, who confessed the horrific crimes as his own. Now in his 80s and serving a life sentence for an unrelated murder, Nassar has never been charged with the killings and denies any involvement. And in 2013, new DNA evidence links Albert DeSalvo to the final killing long attributed to the Strangler. But the rest of the gruesome murders remain unsolved.
The true identity of the Boston Strangler or Stranglers is still a mystery today.
And this switchblade at the Museum of Crime and Punishment in Washington serves as a reminder of the truths Albert DeSalvo took with him to his grave.
Next on Mysteries at the Museum. Across the United States, in the nation's most revered institutions, our celebrated history is on display. Wondrous treasures from the past, bizarre relics. But behind every amazing artifact is another tale to be told and a secret waiting to be revealed. These are the Mysteries at the Museum. In the nation's capital lies a plaster death mask cast from the corpse of one of America's most wanted gangsters. But is it really his face? Or does the mask prove he got away? Find out next on Mysteries at the Museum. Washington, D.C. The nation's capital is home to the biggest names in law enforcement, like the world-famous FBI. So it is a fitting location for the National Museum of Crime and Punishment.
We don't just show the romantic side of American history, we show it all. The good, the bad, and the ugly.
This 25,000 square foot facility houses intriguing artifacts that once belonged to infamous lawbreakers like Jesse James, Bonnie and Clyde, and Al Capone. But among this cache of criminality is one particularly chilling artifact. It's a plaster mold of a man's face made with impressive precision.
Each individual eyebrow is able to be seen.
It's called a death mask, and it was cast directly from the corpse of a notorious bank robber.
Death masks were used as a way to identify criminals upon their passing.
According to the FBI, this death mask is proof that they gunned down a man once known as public enemy number 1, John Dillinger. But to the people that knew the elusive outlaw, the resemblance between the death mask and the man is no dead certainty, leaving some experts to wonder, is this really John Dillinger's death mask? Or did the FBI gun down the wrong man? July 1933, the Great Depression grips the United States. Over 20% of the nation is unemployed. Many citizens blame the banks for the crisis and see the famous bank robber John Dillinger as an outlaw hero.
John Dillinger was the man doing what so many American citizens wanted to do. They wanted to get back at the banks they felt that they had been wronged by.
From 1933 to 1934, Dillinger and his gang knock over 11 banks, grabbing around $300,000. And in that period, Dillinger breaks out of jail twice. It is these exploits that send his popularity skyrocketing.
John Dillinger became more of a mythical figure than an actual man.
But by 1934, a new crime-fighting task force is tracking Dillinger's every move. The FBI. Its leader, J. Edgar Hoover, is determined to establish his reputation by hunting down the nation's most notorious criminal.
The Bureau of Investigation was still cutting its chops, trying to make a name for itself in American society, claiming a place in law enforcement.
But the Bureau can only prosecute federal crimes, so it is powerless to go after Dillinger on state charges. The the FBI watches as the outlaw slips by local authorities in Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. Finally, in the spring of 1934, Dillinger breaks a federal law by driving a stolen police car across state lines. The FBI seizes its chance. The feds track Dillinger to Chicago, where he's lying low with a woman named Anna Sage.
Anna Sage was an immigrant from Romania. She had turned to prostitution and opening a house of ill repute to make ends meet.
Unbeknownst to Dillinger, his confidant is about to betray him.
She was facing deportation, so in an effort to try and save her own skin, she gave up her friend.
On July 22nd, Anna Sage tips off the FBI that she and Dillinger will be at Chicago's Biograph Theater later that night. And in case the feds have trouble spotting Dillinger in the crowd, Anna tells them that she'll be wearing an orange skirt and white blouse. As the movie rolls, a posse of armed agents surround the theater.
There were maybe 20 to 30 agents, sole purpose to hone in on John Dillinger.
When the film ends, Dillinger and his companion leave the theater. 5 shots ring out in the crowd. Hoover gets the news by telephone. 31-year-old John Dillinger is dead outside of the Biograph Theater. But almost immediately, images of the corpse launch rumors that it wasn't Dillinger who died that night. And the death mask made for the FBI from the dead man's face lacks some of Dillinger's signature facial characteristics. The mask is missing a prominent dimple in the chin and a mole above the eye. Coroner's photographs run in the papers, and some of Dillinger's adoring public become suspicious.
When they saw a photo of the corpse, a bloated body with no dimple, no mole, none of the charisma that the man had possessed in life, no one thought it was him.
Did Anna Sage double-cross the feds and bring a stooge to the movies that night? The discrepancies between the death mask and the man himself suggest that perhaps the FBI had shot the wrong man. But in a follow-up investigation, one of Dillinger's comrades reveals the shocking answer to federal agents. In May 1934, just 8 weeks before he died, Dillinger underwent a very primitive form of plastic surgery. The surgeon removed his identifying mole and filled in his signature dimple. For J. Edgar Hoover, this information is proof that the death mask is real and that he did get his man. And for over 20 years, a copy of Dillinger's death mask hangs outside his office door as a trophy.
At the end of the day, J. Edgar Hoover, I'm convinced, did get public enemy number 1.
Dillinger's death cements the nascent FBI's reputation. Through the capture of the high-profile gangster, the Federal Bureau of Investigation takes its place as the nation's premier crime-fighting force.